Well, here we are. We are now well into our period of time, as we've described before. Some churches call it ordinary time. Again, it's got sort of a double meaning. It's ordinary in the sense that it's kind of just the usual stuff, nothing special going on. But ordinary really comes from the notion of ordinal, when we count the Sundays. And so that's kind of the way we all do it, but the numbering system is different from church to church. So today we are going to be looking at the 6th Sunday after Pentecost. So that's our counting. At St. Luke's, we use the time after Pentecost. If you would look in the prayer book, it would give you a number. It would be proper 11, which is what the lectionary would designate it, as well as how you would find the proper prayers for the day, the collect, and so on. In the Roman Catholic Church, it's called ordinary time. And in the Church of England, they don't count from after Pentecost, they count from after Trinity. So if you're ever looking at something that comes like maybe a commentary or such that comes from the Church of England, don't be confused. For example, if this is our 6th Sunday after Pentecost, it is their 5th Sunday after Trinity. So it's all about counting and where you start the count. So that's kind of where we're at. Because we are in the C section of the lectionary, the C cycle, we are reading from the Gospel of Luke. And it seems in these couple Sundays, we're getting, I heard one commentator say this the other day, we are getting the top 40 hits of Luke, the top most popular stories. Last week, we had the story of the Good Samaritan. And this week, we're another very common one that most of us know very well. So it'll be an interesting discussion. And that is the story of Mary and Martha when Jesus is visiting in their home, and the sort of sibling rivalry that occurs between Mary and Martha. Lazarus doesn't seem to figure into that piece of it. Of course, he's a guy, so that's not an issue. And then there's been the various interpretations that we'll go through relative to trying to turn this story, which is neither a parable nor an allegory. It's simply a story of an event in Jesus' life, but it has been spiritually interpreted by many people in several different ways. So we're going to look at some of that as well today. So let's go and look at our so you should be looking at our website. Is that what you're seeing? I hope. Okay, good.
Yes.
All right, good. Thank you. So we'll go and we will go to, well, that says the 5th Sunday. We're going to change that. That's the 6th Sunday after Pentecost, which are the lectionary readings for this day. And again, this is our formation website where this is located. That's a direct link from our homepage. And here is the readings that we can download directly should we want to look at them and print them out. And always on this document too, just to let you know, is also the collect for the day. So if you want to reflect on that along the way, that's also a possibility there. Now, the first lesson is we are reading in a kind of semi-continuous way from the prophet Amos. Amos is one of those prophets that no one likes to read because he's sort of the prototypical nasty guy who's telling everybody what for. The one line I remember when we were studying the prophet Amos was that he calls the women of Israel the cows of Bashan. So it's kind of it's one of those kinds of books. And so unless you're going to study the book as an entity, it sometimes the individual lessons that are set out in the lectionary, unless we're going to do like a series on them preaching, they kind of pop out in different ways, and they can give you a sort of a nasty vision of what's going on. But basically, Amos, just to give you a real quick understanding so you can hear the lesson well, is prophesying against what has come to be called the Northern Kingdom, which is, if you divide the 12 tribes up It's sometimes called the land of the 10 lost tribes, because in the various wars that ensued with Israel after the strength of Israel as an empire really began to decline, and the imperial power of Babylon and Assyria and Persia and so on, all of these things were developing in those ancient days. Israel just became essentially a vassal state of one or another of those empires. And sometimes there were these independence movements that grew up. And then, of course, the imperial powers would come to quash them. And variously, these were seen as punishments by God for having sort of sold their soul to the highest bidder. Again, because the independence of Israel as an entity was always considered the important piece of their legacy. That's important to say. Today, President Biden was in Jerusalem visiting Israel. So it's good to see that, not good to see, I should say, but it's helpful to see that this part of the world has been a hotbed for controversy and for violence and political overthrow and so on from the get-go. One of these days, we might do sort of an introduction to the Old Testament, and we can talk about a segment that I love to talk about called the lands of the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah.
And it really shows this area to be this contested region. And there's a very good reason for that, because on one side you have the Mediterranean, and on the other side you have mountains. So this becomes really Palestine has always been a prized possession, particularly for imperial powers prior to the modern age, in part because it was the way you could get from Asia Minor into the lower parts of the Arabian Peninsula and into Egypt. So it was a wonderful crossroads, we'll say. And you will also hear it called the Levant in those sorts of studies, because the Levant is a wider area than what we classically think of as Palestine. It includes parts of Syria and so on. And these lands have always been contested by great imperial powers, because it is a pinch point for commerce, for transportation, for culture. So the one who controls the Levant, the one who controls, we might call it today Palestine, the whole of Israel, not only the current political state of Israel, but all of that area, has always had the upper hand in any sort of international conflict of imperial powers. So you get so all through the Old Testament, you get these various contestations over this land. And it is variously interpreted by the prophets, particularly as punishment from God. That's how God gets this sort of bad rap of being the God of wrath in the Old Testament. In part because after the decline of what we might call the Empire of Solomon, Israel is divided into essentially two political entities. There's the north, which is the 10 tribes we're talking about today, which is classically called Israel. And then there is the southern two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which are essentially thought of as the southern kingdom. And what happens in history is that the north falls before the south. So that essentially what you get when you get into the later part of the Old Testament, particularly the time of Isaiah and so on, is you're talking about the south more than the north. Now, last week we had the parable of the Samaritan, and that has the whole issue of Samaria and the Samaritans as a sort of half-breed people and so on, has its roots in this kind of division of the kingdoms. So that knowing that history can sometimes give a really good insight as to why even Jesus had some prejudices, why the disciples certainly did, and so on. There was a lot of history there, whether it was in terms of, again, selling one's soul to keep power, to keep, the king on the throne, and keep an independent, a modicum of independence, and so on. And then, of course, the independence movements and that along the way. So you get the what are sometimes called the minor prophets because they're short. People like Amos, Micah, and so on. And often their focus is primarily on, interestingly enough, social justice. That it is one of the major themes through the Old Testament prophets, particularly the minor prophets, is the fact that when Israel falls away from a strict sense of God's justice, namely care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and so on, that Israel is seen as sort of adopting the ways of the world, and in so doing, then they're really betraying their covenant with God. So that the law of Moses becomes the touchstone for the prophets. And as Walter Brueggemann would really kind of remind us, that the role of the prophets is almost always simply to call people back to observance of the covenant of God. So in other words, get thee back to the Torah. And all of the terms in the Torah, not just the ritual and religious observances, but particularly, again, when we talk about the minor prophets in particular, the care for the poor and the marginalized. So that theme, when we talk about it in Christianity, is not new or special or unique to Jesus. This is a prophetic theme all through the history of the Old Testament. And so when Jesus is really kind of calling people to a better observance of the law of Moses, he is right in this tradition, which of course, when you start calling people the cows of Bashan, doesn't make you a very popular person. So while Jesus doesn't use those kind of coarse terms, he sometimes does. If you recall, you might remember in Matthew's gospel where he calls the scribes and the Pharisees a brood of vipers. That's a pretty nasty thing. You're a snake's den. You're lower than a snake's belly, we might say, in the Wild West or something like that. So that a whole idea is that, you are in league with the serpent who betrayed our ancient ancestors, Adam and Eve. Go back to the story of Genesis and so on. So that's this whole thing from Amos. I keep forgetting that you're looking at text and I'm looking at you in a screen here. Then we have the epistle from Colossians, which we won't go into very much today, but here's a very short gospel lesson, so we'll read it quickly. From the 10th chapter of Luke, as Jesus and his disciples went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, Lord, do you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Here ends the lesson. Well, this is that wonderful story. You can almost see the scene in your mind's eye. Jesus is invited into the home by Martha. And then Mary says, oh, here's this wonderful rabbi. I'm going to listen to him. So she sits at his feet, which is a classic arrangement now. That's not because she's a woman and she's subjected or any of that kind of stuff. This is a classic way in which people are described when they are near their rabbi, their teacher. So, we sometimes use the phrase, even in English, he studied at the feet of. When my mentor, for example, might say, when I was doing my doctoral work, I studied at the feet of Bob Kennedy. It would have been that kind of thing where often teachers sat and students then gathered around, and usually below the head of the teacher for a couple of reasons. One was that was a mark of respect, but it was also so that everybody could hear. So you get these images even in ancient Greece when you talk about Socrates and Aristotle and so on. They're seated, and their disciples, their students, are seated around them at a slightly lower level. And it is also, just to make a little bit of a point here, why we have these things we called cathedra, or thrones, or we have cathedrals, which has the bishop's chair. Because classically, when a bishop taught, he taught ex cathedra, he taught from the chair. He didn't stand in a pulpit, and he didn't stand at the crossing. He sat in his chair, because the chair is the sign of authority. That's why in the Episcopal Church we have a cathedral which houses the bishop's chair. So it is from the principal church of the diocese, the cathedral, where the bishop sits regularly, or at least in theory. That's where from which he teaches. And so that's a very old reference, and it goes all the way back into the early days of Catholicism in the 4th and 5th century. So that the bishop is seen as the principal teacher of the faith. We in the Episcopal Church do have a tradition. We don't really have it per se at St. Luke's, where there will be 2 chairs for presidential officers over the liturgy. One will be where the rector normally sits, and then there'll be another chair, but hardly anybody ever sits in it, and it's called the bishop's chair. Because in the Episcopal polity, technically speaking, the bishop is the pastor of every parish. That's why we're not called pastors, we're called rectors. Because the word rector is actually a means, it goes, again, that's it, medieval canon law. You are governing that particular portion of the people of God in the name of the bishop. So that while I am, as rector, the CEO of our parish corporation and so on, symbolically, the bishop is the chief pastor and chief teacher. And so that's why the bishop is required to make a visitation to every parish on a regular basis. The canons demand this. So a parish should never say that we've never seen the bishop, because if they're a parish properly constituted in the diocese, the bishop must go there by the dictates of the law. Now, some places he's going to go more frequently than others because there are various ceremonies and things that need to happen. And the visitation is supposed to be something separate from the normal administration of confirmation and reception. The idea, again, being that the bishop goes to visit with the people, not simply to perform certain functions. Now, regrettably, in some ways, we've lost a little bit of that understanding, because in the United States, we seem to appoint bishops to be principal administrators, which the administration of a parish is really the task of the rector. But we make the bishop the principal administrator of the diocese, which is really, in traditional terms, what the archdeacon's role is supposed to be. But again, because of budgets and thus so, and power structures in the United States and so on, we follow the CEO model so faithfully along the way. We've adopted that sort of secular viewpoint that we don't see the bishop primarily as teacher or pastor. We see the bishop as the primary administrator of the diocese. And so it's all about money and councils and all that sort of thing. rather than being out and about and among the people, sitting on the chair teaching. So when we get pastoral letters from our bishops, how often do we really read them? They're supposed to be one of the instruments by which the bishop is teaching the people of his flock, the diocese, so that when we put them up on our website or we send them out, people should read them. Our current bishop, Bishop Nichols, is much more in that mold of being a pastor and a teacher. And so he doesn't really send letters very often, but in our current modern technologies, they are often video statements. And he usually does one on the key holy days of the church, Easter, Christmas, and so on. But then for example, there was just one recently on gun violence, and last year on racial justice. So there are a number of things that I think we need to be a bit more careful about listening. And it goes back, bring it full circle, goes back to this notion of the teacher, the rabbi, being the authoritative figure and the disciples gathering round. Now, in this case, in this view of this story, we only have really 2 or 3 disciples. Jesus is there alone. His disciples are not with him, his band of 12. He's been invited personally by Martha to have dinner. And as often happens, when somebody's in the kitchen fixing dinner, somebody's got to take care of the guest and sort of entertain them. Now, we don't hear about Lazarus here. This is the same household where Lazarus is, so maybe Lazarus was out doing something. But you can just hear Martha in the kitchen banging the pots around. She gets more and more perturbed that she's got to do all of this herself. And Mary has taken on herself the privilege of being the one who gets to talk to the guest of honor. So, it's this sort of sibling, like, bang, where is she? I got to do all this myself. Bang, you can hear the pot stirring or the logs being thrown on the open fire, whatever it is, that's going on. We've all experienced those kinds of things ourselves, like, I need help in here. Or so whoever's setting the table, the plates go really heavily onto the table, to the point where you wonder if they're going to break or something. Those kinds of things can happen. And Mary is just loving, with the art that is surrounds this particular gospel scene. Mary's just devotedly looking at Jesus with great love, and Jesus is talking to her. He's not really paying attention to Mary or Martha in the kitchen either. Maybe he's hearing the pots scraped and banged about, but maybe he just thinks that she's a little klutzy. We don't know what's in Jesus' mind about all of that. And then finally, Martha's had it. She bursts into the living room, let's use modern terminology, and she says, Lord, don't you care? Basically, you can almost hear a different kind of conversation. I invited you to dinner. You don't even care that I have to do all this work, and she's just sitting here. But this, when we use St. Ignatius reflection, it's called the meditation of space, which is basically putting yourself into the gospel lesson and letting yourself imagine the scene play out in front of you. When I've done that, that's kind of the way I see this. There is this sort of sibling argument going on between Martha and Mary, and Jesus kind of getting caught in the middle. And then Jesus sort of looking up and going, oh, maybe he's thinking, I don't want to get in the middle of this. So, he's saying, Martha, you're just worried about so many things. Don't, as Jesus might say, we've been all guests in another home, don't fuss so much. It's not that important. You've invited me here to eat. Just, put something on the table. We'll be fine. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be your best. It just, I'm just happy to be here. And that's sort of could be Jesus' attitude in this. And then, and then he says this, and this is where we get kind of caught up in this whole thing. He says, Martha, Mary has chosen the better part, and she will not be deprived of it. Now, through history, this has been interpreted variously in 2 dimensions of Christian spirituality. One is actionable and the other is passive. And in traditional religious life, in other words, the life, consecrated life, if we want to say that, people who join religious orders and so on, we have what is called the contemplative orders, those that basically spend their time in prayer and study and listening and often they're cloistered, so they don't have the cares of the world about them and so on. And then we have what we call the active orders or the apostolic groups. And they're the ones who band together they pray, of course, and study, but for a different purpose, and that's to go out into the world and do things. So we get this almost like somebody is drawing a line that it's an either or option for people. And that through history, there has always been this sort of almost judgmentalism about that the notion of being a contemplative is a higher purpose. And see, this kind of derives from what Jesus says when he says, Mary has chosen the better part. So, for example, in traditional religious life, traditional religious orders, which in the Anglican tradition sort of has had a love-hate relationship, in part because part of what Henry VIII, was suppress the monastery. So basically, and he did that not because he resented them, he did that because he wanted their money for the royal coffers, because he was waging wars that he couldn't pay for. So, he basically suppressed the monasteries. And so in Anglicanism, we kind of lost this long-standing tradition. But interestingly, in the resurgence in the Oxford movement in the 19th century, we kind of rediscovered part of this. And so there are various Church of England or Episcopalian monasteries with brotherhoods and sisterhoods and so on that sort of come back. It's sort of making a re-entry. But then we have the crush of the modern world. So many of them, again, just sort of dissipated again because that, the modern world kind of pressed in on them, financials, all that sort of thing. But there are still some there. For example, there's a monastery of monks up on the Hudson called the Holy Cross Monastery. They're Benedictines by rule. In fact, I want to bring one or two of them to St. Luke's periodically, where, in the future to have like a day apart, to have a retreat day, and they would help us, guide us through the retreat day. And there are active orders as well. The cloistered or the Benedictine rule tends to focus on contemplation and study and so on. But then you have like the Franciscans. We all know, we may know Franciscans, for example, David Rutledge often comes to evensong at St. Luke's. He's from Lancaster. He's a third order Franciscan. Go ahead.
My son-in-law is one.
Oh, there you go. See, so that when these are considered the more active orders, because the notion is that the apostolate or the work that's being done derives from their spiritual life. So it's more about being in the world and doing things, taking care. And you frequently will find folks very involved in things like soup kitchens and food lines and food pantries and caring for the poor and the marginalized. Those apostolates tend to be very much a part of that community. Particularly with the Franciscans, they themselves, the original name that Francis of Assisi wanted to give to his little band of followers was Little Brothers of the Poor. The idea was that you were in solidarity with those who were poor in the world, and you helped to meet their needs by bringing the gospel to them, first of all. And as it's often quoted, there's so much of this, we're not quite sure how much is apocryphal and how much actually came from the mouth of Francis. But, preach the gospel always and use words when necessary. So it's this notion of how we live and what we do is the way that we get the gospel across to other people. So these traditions over the centuries have sort of been at both odds and complementary to one another, and they find a spiritual basis in this particular passage, where there is this notion of sitting at the Lord's feet, contemplating the words of Jesus, contemplating the mysteries of God, contemplating the words of Scripture, learning everything that you can in order to understand them better. And then the active side, which is to go out and, as Rob Box has sort of got us to think about, in vestry and so on, to pray with our feet. He's quoting actually Mother Teresa when he says that. He says, it's something that means a lot to him, that we pray with our feet. In other words, we don't just sit around and navel gaze or, have these little prayer circles and things. We go out and we actually do things inspired by our spiritual lives and what we've done. So these two things find this long history, this long tradition in the church, centuries long, finds its basis in Scripture, if you will, in this particular passage, where you have Martha and Mary, two sisters. I remember preaching on this as a senior in, as a fourth year seminarian, as a deacon in the seminary. And I had to preach on this, and I was I felt very good when my New Testament prof came into the sacristy when we were taking our vestments off and everything. David, you made a good point. I'm glad you said that. And I went, what? Just what part of it? He said, you said that Mary and Martha lived in the same house. That this constant bickering we have, which is the better way, is really not the point. The point is that they were sisters. They were related, and they worked together most of the time. So that, the idea is one supports the other. And it is interesting then when you get into very old school, very traditional contemplative communities. Like back in the days when I was a Roman priest, I would periodically be asked to celebrate liturgy and so on we had two contemplative orders of women, the cloistered Dominicans and cloistered Carmelites in the city of Buffalo in monasteries. Regrettably, both of them no longer exist. They've been amalgamated with other communities. But they always had what were called the extern sisters. The extern sisters were people who intervened between the cloister and the world. They were the ones who went out, did the shopping. They were the ones who went out and got the workmen to come in and do plumbing or whatever. They did not live with the cloistered sisters. They had their own little community. Because the cloistered sisters were just that. They were to be unsullied and untouched by the concerns of the world. The extern sisters, and if there were probably 24 cloistered nuns at the time that I would go there, there were, I think, 6 externs. And so they were like on shifts that they would work. So when I came, for example, I was the one who talked to them. The only cloistered nuns that I would ever talk to, I talked through this really weird sort of contraption. I mean, how we get into these things, where the sacred vessels and the bread and the wine, everything would be prepared in the sacristy on the cloistered side, and there would be a turnstile, and they would put it in, and then they would sort of spin it around, and then you would take those things, so that you could be ready for liturgy. And there were little holes in the back, and so that in case you needed to speak to the sister, and you were not to speak to have a conversation, you were only saying, sister, I need X. We almost never needed anything because it was always there. But if there was something missing, or you needed more wine or bread or whatever, because there was a larger crowd in the public facing part of the chapel. And there was literally a rood screen. There was a grate of, bars in a sense between. There were 2 wings to the chapel. It would be like in our church that the cloistered nuns would be in the transept, like where the organ is in the baptistry. There would be a rood screen that would separate them from the rest of the church, and then there would be the nave of the church, which is where the public could come. And the public could come and hear the sisters pray their offices on a regular basis and so on, but they did not interact. So there's this notion of the separateness. And so we can take this bifurcation between Martha and Mary, and we can take it to extremes. Or we can do it more like St. Ignatius, one of my patrons. My spirituality is primarily Ignatian. I'm a closet Jesuit, I guess. This notion of active contemplation. See, he puts the two together. He said every Jesuit needs to learn how to contemplate, to think on, enter into the mysteries of the Bible, the scriptures, and so on. So the 40 days exercise of St. Ignatius, or the 19th annotation, which is a different form of it, is to train you up to do this. And then you do this on a regular basis. And then what happens is the next question is always with Ignatius, so what? Now, what are you going to do? So you contemplate, you pray, you think, you reflect, so that you are ready for action. And that's more the notion, I think, which is helpful for us who live in the world, and yet really need to go in deeply into the notion. I mean, it's why it's so relevant to me as a parish priest, is that I don't have the time or the leisure to become a contemplative where I can sequester myself up, in my study and just sort of pop out when you need me for something, but rather to be active in the world, to go out into the community, to be with people in the community, to be engaging community organizations, other people, other churches, and so on, but rooted in a deeply spiritual life, which I pray I'm at least adequate at, so that this Martha and Mary bifurcation, this division, is done away with. And so in one sense, what Father Bonaventure said to me was sort of gave me a clue as to what my own heart was telling me, is that Martha and Mary live in the same house. So that for each and all of us, that's necessary, in my view, that we all contemplate, we all think about what Jesus has to say. What is Jesus speaking? And what is he speaking to me about? Each one of us individually. And then to have Martha come in along the way and say, okay, now it's time to get up and do something about it. So, get up and set the table, get up, or as Rob would say, pray with your feet. I find, quite frankly, too many parish clergy who say, my work is my prayer. They kind of take the Benedictine rule to an extreme. So they don't ever bother setting aside time or setting aside space for deep prayer and contemplation. And very often we find in clergy circles that this leads to psychological and emotional burnout. It's often why the level of depression is high among clergy. And that clergy, quite frankly, run into some of the problems of addictions, whether primarily alcohol, but sometimes food, sometimes other things, because the soul is not being adequately nurtured for the demands of the apostolate, of the ministry. So that what I would contend was to all of us, around this table today in this room, that to the extent that we are active about the church's work, to the extent that we are active about Christian ministry, similarly, should we be expending energy on our spiritual growth? Because only when we really get down and deep into our soul do we find the energy that we really need to accomplish the work that Jesus has set out for us to do. That's why I think in this particular passage, Martha and Mary are equally important. While Jesus says Mary has chosen the better part, I think that's not so much a sort of a dictum to say contemplation is the better life, but rather that it's a sort of a clarion call, if you will, to begin to see that for followers of Jesus, all of our action, all of our activity needs to be rooted in the teachings of Jesus. Otherwise, Sue and I have had this discussion in a different context. All the stuff we do, feeding ministries, ESL, all that, it just becomes social work with a cross stamped on it. It isn't truly gospel kingdom work. Now, I'm not saying it has no impact on the kingdom or the gospel, to be sure, but there is a qualitative difference when Christians are doing it out of their heart and in the name of the love of Christ than, for example, when it's a government program or a government service. Are people benefiting? Yes, they are. No question about it. But does it have the true capacity to speak of the love of God and the purposes for which God has made us when it's merely providing services? And maybe the branding of it is, the Episcopal shield or the cross of the evangelical church, or the papal coat of arms for the Catholics, or whatever it is. It's just, it's a branding exercise rather than a genuine encounter with another person. Which brings us back then to our baptismal covenant and why it's so important for us to remember always those last two portions of that covenant whenever we're busy about the work of the church. To seek and to find the face of Christ in all persons, and then to strive for justice and peace and uphold the dignity of every human person. That those two things are rooted in, for us as Episcopalians, in our baptism, which is what marks us out. Remember the cross at the end of the ceremony, marks us out as Christ's own. So that as we do these things, it is Christ that is doing them. And not simply meeting somebody's need, but rather that the love of God is being communicated. And so that then should color how we do this work. I've often, again, not to throw stones, I don't mean to do that, but the qualitative difference that, for example, in our work, pre-COVID with LCCM and the free noon meal, my experience of other churches, yes, they're feeding the poor, they're feeding those who are in need and so on. But the attitude about it, it's sort of like, well, here we are, here's the food, take it and go. Whereas when, we're typically Episcopalian, we have to be seated and we have to have our nice china and all this kind of stuff. We don't use china for free noon meal, but it's at least there are places that are being set. The meal is served. It's not merely, sort of a chow line that you go through. Those are small and subtle ways in which we're communicating the love of God in a different way. We're respecting the dignity of the human persons that we're serving. Even they may not say a word to us, not even a thank you or anything, but we don't do it for that purpose. I've heard people sometimes saying, I've pulled them aside. Well, I don't even get a thank you. Well, that's not why you're here, is it? How many times can you say to somebody, I love you, before they say, I love you back? It's not always an equal and opposite relationship. And we also begin to realize that our relationship with Christ is not an equal and opposite relationship. That it's a relationship of grace and mercy and loving kindness and compassion that Jesus shows to us first, and then we respond in kind. So that this notion of wedding together, contemplation, if you will, we'll use that as a shorthand for our spiritual life and how we reflect on it, think on it, and how we live it out in what we do for the sake of others, becomes a hallmark of who we are. And the fact that we have deliberately in our prayer book put those two pieces into the baptismal covenant, it's not only the creed, it's not only our profession of faith, but we have said that, yes, putting these two things together is essential for the Christian life. Comments?
Well, I think when I look at St. Luke's, we are a collection of Marys and Marthas. And it changes as life changes us, particularly as we get older. And now I find myself very much wanting to know about the real meaning of Jesus's love, rather than helping out when we have a big meeting and we were looking for soup and preparing for all kinds of stuff for that. And we have those people who are the Marthas, always keeping us going, and as long as they can. And we're all in a loving relationship. I don't see those people ever complaining, but we have those of us that want to be more contemplative, look at them and boy, we really need those people to keep this place going.
Yeah. Well, I can say, George, I do hear them complaining.
Yeah.
Where's everybody else? How come I have to do all this? Kind of thing. And it's a very Martha thing. It's like, yeah, okay, but then I have to try to play the peacemaker here, like Jesus did. There are other people doing other things, and maybe it's one of the things that I like about, and I've prayed about this with this passage. When Jesus is Martha, Mary, Martha, you're worried about so many things. It's too often we worry about getting it done ourselves rather than reaching out and incorporating and engaging others or bringing others along. Some of the elders in our parish, I continually am talking to about, you need to ask others. You've done it all these years. Everybody's just going to take it for granted. I'm sorry. It's just the way it is. It's human nature. If you want other people to get involved, ask them. And then don't be bossing them around all the time. They're going to have their own ways of doing things, and like you did, but now you're the elder, and so you think it's your way or the highway. Well, then don't complain when no one comes to help. So we have those kinds of conversations all the time.
Well, I always think of when I read this passage this morning to know what we were going to talk about, Saint Teresa of Avila had a comment in one of her works saying, it's only a man's way to do things to criticize Martha, when you know right well and good that somebody has to fix the food.
Right.
And if you have a guest of honor in your house, you're going to try to do your best for that guest. And I think that I chuckled the first time I found the comment, because she talks in many of her works about Mary and Martha, and is very much trying to unpack, like you did, the Mary-Martha situation. I mean, she did not dismiss the Marthas because she was a Martha.
Yeah.
I mean, Teresa of Avila was really a woman of action.
She was.
That also had profound experiences in the mystic experiences she had. And I was remembering another story that I heard of a very well-known, I'm not going to name, writer of mysticism and contemplative prayer and all that in contemporary world. And one day he decided, because that was the best place to go do the meditation time in the back porch of the house while the wife prepared food for the kids and for him. And all of a sudden, when he was immersed in that silence, he felt something pass him by. And it was a fish, a frozen fish, coming from the kitchen. His wife was getting tired of him contemplating in the porch while she was trying to put some order into the chaos of the kitchen. But what you said make me think that I have seen that impatience both in the active as in the contemplative. And it was a good thing for you to mention how important both of them are in our lives, because one of the things, having lived a lot in the world of political action, personally, I have discovered how angry some people are when they are immersed only in the political action, the social justice part, and do not have enough time for prayer and remembering, why are we doing this? And it's a struggle, because you feel like we need to do it now. We need to solve it today. We need to do, and yet there are things that you may try to fix, and 20 years from now have not changed that significantly. And what are you going to do? You can only do what is possible with the best guidance you can get out of that time of reflection, meditation, prayer. You take care of the portion you're allotted while you can.
For sure. I think, that's been part of the criticism of the church often, is that the church is not politically active enough. There is a legitimate place for the church in the public square. And I think we've misinterpreted this notion of church and state to the point where we've escaped controversy by not living out certain values. However, I think if we root what we want to do and say deeply in our teaching and in our traditions and in our prayer, that we will, I hope, always come out on the side of answering the question, what does God want us to do in this place at this time? I can share with you, I talked to the executive committee the other day. I said, I am really feeling deeply, deeply moved to make a statement, to do something about the plague of gun violence in our communities. And I'm praying about that. I'm really contemplating and trying to study. And I'm going back, what has our church said about these things, and trying to integrate all of that so that if and when I say something about that, maybe in a pastoral letter or a video statement or something, that it can't simply be seen as taking a political position, rather than trying to bring the gospel to bear on this difficult social problem that we're facing. And that can be true of anything. It can be true, when you get this thing in your gut about something, whether it's about poverty or about homelessness, or it's about food insecurity, or about any of the other issues that we constantly face in society. It's that fire in the belly, if you will, that gets people to do things. As a pastor, my role as pastor, one of the things I have to be careful about is that fire is being ignited by the Spirit and not by the desires of the world. And that doesn't mean that we don't say anything. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we find. If I can digress for a moment, we did this during COVID. Our Lenten adult series was about what are the church's teachings about various social matters. Because it was an election year. We were moving into the election of 2020. So during the summer, we had this sort of adult forum series in the afternoon on Sundays, where we talked about abortion and violence and social justice, economic justice, and these things, and tried to sort of ground our wanting to. We wanted to ground our sense of what decisions would we make in the ballot box in the teachings of the church. And I think there was some moderate success about that, because some of these questions are so big you really can't talk about them, and you can only read so much in a given time and so on. But I do think we need to start doing that a bit more. Otherwise, we become just pew sitters, and we're neither Martha nor Mary. See, that's the danger too. You can be neither. You can get, because I think if we listen enough to the gospel and we get down and we allow the Spirit to start working in us, inevitably the Spirit will move us to action. That's probably why I'm more spiritually a Jesuit than anything else, because I really think that's where the answer lies. We need to get down to the point where something that is rumbling around, as I said last Sunday in the sermon, we are most effectively moved to action by something not in the head or the heart, but in the bowels, down in the very core of who we are. And I love that phrase, which I remember from some political training I had years ago in terms of organizing and so on. We need to find out where our passions are. Where's the fire in the belly for something? Because if it's not there, that we are from where we are moved, it often just sort of falls down and falls away. It's very easy to lose interest intellectually. It's and emotions, they come and go with the wind. But when something is down deep, visceral in our being, it's very hard for us to put it away until we actually begin to express what it is that's moving us. Tom.
Well, David, let me observe that I think that these Bible studies that you put on here, it's a shame more people don't participate in these, because I've become much more of a Mary since I've been attending these. Much more contemplative, when they're over, and as I go through my days. And with this plethora of political issues that our nation and well, in fact, the world is facing now, it's really helped me to sort through how I think about these things. I think about these things much differently than I did before I commenced these Bible studies. And your teachings here of plumbing the depths of these Gospels has been of just immense benefit to me. And I hope becoming a better Christian, and maybe even being a little bit more active and compassionate in my thinking than I once was.
Thank you, Tom, for that. But and moving away from sort of the sort of pat on the back, but the notion, just that last piece that you said, I think is the critical piece that we need to take away from this passage, and that is that this notion of contemplation, this notion of listening to the voice of Jesus, hearing the voice of Jesus, studying the voice of what Jesus says, and so on, should move us toward compassion. And compassion is what moves us to action. One cannot have true compassion without a movement to the other. I think that was part of the lesson of last week's gospel lesson, with the Good Samaritan. When, in the sermon, we talked a little bit about this notion of being moved from the very bowels of one's being. I borrowed an image from another preacher, why did the Samaritan cross the road? That notion of, well, even the chicken, why did the chicken cross the road? To get to the other side. It's just, it's sort of a natural common sense thing that in the Samaritan's life, to do what the Samaritan did to the man who had been beset by the robbers was as commonsensical and immediate response as a chicken crossing the road to get to the other side. There didn't need to be an overarching thing, and that's why I shared the two incidents that, that I got had a public confession about myself, because I had to think about it, and that says to me, you need to pray more because your compassion is coming from your head, not from your gut. And I know people in this world, I know people in my own life who have lived that out, that there is no thinking about it. They simply respond. And that's not only to people who are in deep need, like the robber along the road, or in my examples, the man that, sits on the curb near the Starbucks where I go on Sunday mornings, or the gentleman who fell in the rest stop on the turnpike. There are people who wouldn't think twice about it. And so I'm saying, the fact that I had to think about it, I had to make a judgment. Will I be late for mass? Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know, because, we can sometimes respond from our gut and sometimes get ourselves in a lot of trouble, unwarranted trouble, I should say. But at the same time, we should make all three work together. Maybe that's what was happening. I don't know. I think about it some more. But it did make me think some more, to contemplate a bit more about whether or not I was truly acting out of a spirit of compassion. Or was I acting out of guilt? I'm a priest. I should do these things. And it does make a difference what that is. And to hear you say, it does my soul so much good to hear you say that you are becoming a more compassionate person because of these studies. That's exactly what this passage is about. That Mary, in her devotion to Jesus, becomes herself more compassionate. Martha's up and ready to do anything, make soup for everybody. You're hungry, I'll make you soup. It's just the way, that's Martha's response. But is it out of compassion? Is it out of the love of Christ? Those are the questions we need to ask. It may be that's sort of the Mother Teresa's among us. That it is in Mother Teresa, it is a both and. Now that she is a saint in the sense that I love Joseph Campbell's definition of saintliness. Someone, I don't know if you know, he's an anthropologist. He did a lot of deep Jungian study, psychology, and so on. He wrote, his seminal work was The Hero Has a Thousand Faces, and basically saw patterns in all of our legends and hero stories and so on. And he also began to study religions and knows a lot about the various religions because they became the very stuff of his work. And someone in an audience in a talk he was giving said, you really are a saint. He says, I'm no saint. And he wasn't just being, sort of good Catholic Christian humble kind of stuff, because he defined it this way: a saint is someone who takes one system. I study all of the systems and I try to find what's common in all of them. So I can't be a saint. A true saint takes one system, say one religious system, and lives it utterly. In other words, takes it to its logical conclusions. So to be a Christian, for example, is to the oft quoted hymn that you hear me quote so many times because it's a touchstone for me. The Philippians hymn from the second chapter of Paul's letter to the Philippians. Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but took the form of a slave, being born into the likeness of men, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That to live that utterly, because the end of that is he even humbled himself even unto death on a cross. That's the ultimate statement of Christianity. And saints in the Christian tradition are people who take that and they make that their watchword. They make that their byword. That everything about their life is moving them to that point. They may never get there. Few of us ever do. But those who do in various ways, Carmen pointed out St. Teresa of Avila, one of the greatest contemplatives of all times, a mystic, we call her, because she is one of the few that had what we call an ecstatic experience of the Spirit and lived to tell about it. And the rest of her life was dedicated to getting back to there, and she never did. It was instantaneous. It was just a glimpse. Essentially, what we might say, it's a glimpse of God. And it lasted, it was just an instant. But it was so profound that it inspired the rest of her life. The rest of us kind of do it in very gradual, sort of one step at a time sort of things. Perhaps, it's interesting when Mother Teresa was put up for sainthood, and the promoter of justice, as they're called, in common parlance, the devil's advocate, was able to point out in some of her journals that there were times of great despair in her life. And she wasn't always the up-looking, positive, person we often think of with Mother Teresa, but it was in the depths of that despair that often then she found the light, which brought her round, and that became her constant hope. So then when we say those words, for example, in the burial office, when we introduce the creed, in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection, that sure and certain hope is the stuff of faith. And so saints then begin living that sure and certain hope out. And that's where compassion comes in. That's what knits it all together in the world. The goal of every Buddhist is compassion, interestingly enough. That it is to understand that the sufferings of the world are but fleeting. But the greatest task of the human being is to suffer with those who suffer, because it is fleeting. And by so doing, we put away the ego, and in putting away the ego, we find our truest self. We can circle that right back to the Philippians hymn again. And of course, there are derivatives, for example, Confucianism and excuse me, Hinduism sort of devolved from Buddhist thought and so on. So that there's most of again, going back to Campbell, most of the world's religions all come back to this fundamental truth. So to see the story of Martha and Mary as merely two sisters fighting over who should be taking care of the household chores is to not give it its due. There is a reason this is included in Luke's gospel. Again, remember Luke. Luke is the one who raises up women. Women are raised up as equals in Luke's gospel. Took the church along, still struggling with that notion. But it has its origins in Luke's gospel. Luke's gospel is the gospel to the Gentiles, remember, as well. So all of that starts to fall into these prototypical images of people like Martha and Mary. Some have said, that Martha was the Gentile and, Mary was the Jew. in the sense that the Gentiles were about the things of the world and the work and all that sort of thing. And the Jews were the ones who contemplated the Torah. I mean, there's been all of these different various interpretations through the centuries. And to say that any one of them is definitive is to not do justice to this passage. Any other comments, questions? We have our very own Martha here. She's very faithful to her name.
And yet, I mean, this has been really helpful for me because I've never really liked Martha. Martha's always kind of whining and complaining, and I mean, maybe she's trying to do good things, but also from the point of view that Martha was easily distracted. That is so me. That's one of my downfalls. This is helpful. This makes me feel a little better about Martha.
Well, and to think soon, they ultimately all sat down to dinner.
Right. Okay. And it was a good dinner.
Yes, and it was a good dinner, and it was well prepared. And they all were full, having shared at the same table. See, that's the other thing. Like I love the image that I often talk about why I am in the Episcopal Church. If someone asks me, "What's your reason?" Give me one reason. I will say because we can be of such disparate ideas and still share the same table.
I love that fact that it's all right to ask questions.
Yep. And we can be left and right, extremely conservative, progressive, whatever, but ultimately when it comes down to it, we all come to the same table. And it is the Lord who is there. That's why I love using that little passage on the Saturday service, come, this is not the table of the church, but of the Lord. Come, you who have much faith and you who have little, you who have loved him greatly and you who seek to love him more, you who have, et cetera, et cetera. There's both sides of that. And, come, for it is the Lord who invites you here, and he wants those who seek him to find. Oh, that was profound, now wasn't it? Well, with that in mind, then I think we're kind of coming to a close today. We will continue to meet, through the summer. Once in a while, I'll have to sort of cancel out periodically, as we have in the past, when I have board meetings and things that I don't have any control over when they meet. But I think we're back. I'm off vacation now for a while, so we'll be back next week. And hopefully we'll see you all then.
Plan to be there.
Take care,
Thank
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.